The rain in suburban New Jersey didn't fall. It assaulted. It lashed against the windshield of Eleanor Vance's Volvo, blurring the neat rows of manicured lawns and colonial-style houses on Elmwood Lane. It was 6:42 p.m. on a Tuesday, the exact hour Eleanor usually poured herself a glass of Pinot Grigio and sat on her back porch, listening to the cicadas. Instead, she was sitting in her car, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped animal rhythm. She looked at the passenger seat. A single medium-sized Samsonite suitcase sat there, containing 3 changes of clothes, her medication, and her late husband's silver pocket watch. That was all she had left of her life. 2 hours ago, she had driven back from a 5-day wellness retreat in upstate New York, a trip her daughter-in-law, Chloe, had practically begged her to take. "You look so tired, Mom," Chloe had said, her voice dripping with that sickening, syrupy sweet concern she always weaponized. You deserve a break. Let us take care of the house. Eleanor had believed her. She wanted to believe her. Since David passed away 3 years ago, the silence in the 4-bedroom house had been deafening, and when her son Julian asked to move in temporarily to save for a down payment, Eleanor had opened her doors with a grateful heart. She thought she was saving them. She didn't realize she was letting the wolves into the fold. Eleanor turned off the ignition. The sudden silence inside the car was heavy, filled only with the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the downpour on the roof. She grabbed her purse, pulled her coat tightly around her shoulders, and stepped out into the deluge. Every step up the cobblestone walkway felt like walking through wet cement. This was the house she and David had bought 30 years ago. They had scraped together pennies, skipped vacations, and worked 80-hour weeks to pay off the mortgage. Every scratch on the hardwood floors had a story. Every corner held a memory of Julian's childhood, his first steps in the hallway, his height marks etched into the pantry door frame. She reached the front porch, shivering, and pulled out her house keys. She slid the brass key into the deadbolt. It wouldn't turn. Eleanor frowned, water dripping from the brim of her hood into her eyes. She pulled the key out, wiped it on her dry coat pocket, and tried again. It didn't even slide in all the way. The cylinder was completely different. It was a brand new sleek, smart lock system. A cold dread, far freezing than the June rain, pooled in her stomach. She pressed the electronic doorbell. The little circular LED light glowed a mocking blue. A sharp ping echoed inside the house. She waited. 10 seconds. 30 seconds. 1 minute. "Julian," Eleanor called out, her voice swallowed by the sound of the rain. She knocked on the heavy oak door. "Chloe? It's Mom. I'm home early. Open the door, please." No one answered, but Eleanor saw the curtain in the upstairs guest room twitch. Someone was looking down at her. Margot, Chloe's mother, the uninvited guest, who had come for a weekend visit 2 months ago and simply refused to leave. Suddenly, a mechanical click echoed from the doorbell. The small speaker crackled to life. Julian's voice came through, but it didn't sound like her son. It sounded distant, hollow, and defensive. "Mom, you shouldn't be here." Eleanor stared at the little camera lens. "Julian? What are you talking about? I'm freezing. My key doesn't work. Open the door." "We changed the locks, Mom," Julian said. There was a pause, a heavy rustle in the background, and Eleanor could hear Chloe's sharp, urgent whisper. Tell her the rest, Julian. Don't back down. Julian cleared his throat through the speaker. You need to leave, Mom. You're trespassing. We've established legal tenancy now. Margot has been here for over 60 days. And I signed a formal lease agreement with her as the primary resident occupant while you were away. Under state law, this is our legal domicile. The police can't touch us, and they won't throw us out. Eleanor felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. The rain seemed to roar louder, deafening her. Trespassing? Julian, I own this house. My name is on the deed. What are you doing? We're doing what we have to do for our family. Julian's voice cracked, a flash of defensive anger breaking through his robotic tone. You have all this money, Mom. You have David's life insurance, your pension, and this giant house all to yourself, while Chloe and I are drowning. We asked you for help with a down payment, and you gave us a lecture about hard work. Margot actually helps us. She supports us. Margot is a parasite, Julian. Eleanor cried out, her dignity fracturing as tears finally mingled with the rain on her cheeks. She's using you. Chloe is using you. Please, look at what you are doing to your own mother. Don't drama bait us, Eleanor. Chloe's voice suddenly cut into the intercom, sharp and devoid of any of her usual fake sweetness. You've been hostile and aggressive since my mother moved in. You made her feel unsafe in her own skin. We have a legal right to peace and quiet enjoyment of our rented property. Go find a motel, Eleanor. Your suitcase is on the side porch under the awning. Don't try to come back, or we will call the cops and file an order of protection for harassment. The intercom went dead with a cold, digital beep. The blue light turned off. Eleanor stood frozen on the porch. The world around her, the neighborhood she had known for 3 decades, felt completely alien. She walked with numb, trembling legs to the side porch. There, resting against the brick wall, shielded poorly from the wind-driven rain, was her suitcase. She grabbed the handle. It was wet. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip it. She looked back at the front door. The house was brightly lit from the inside. She could see the warm, golden glow of the living room chandelier, the one she had picked out with David for their 25th anniversary. She could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass. They were inside, warm and dry, eating dinner in her kitchen, sitting on her furniture, while she stood in the dark, locked out by her own flesh and blood. The betrayal wasn't just a sharp pain. It was a physical weight that crushed the air from her lungs. She had spent 28 years protecting Julian, sacrificing her own needs to ensure he had the best education, the best opportunities, and a safety net. And this was the return on her investment. A calculated, legal ambush executed the moment her back was turned. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor dragged her suitcase back down the walkway. Each squelch of her wet shoes felt like a humiliation. She lifted the suitcase into the trunk of her Volvo, her body shivering uncontrollably from a combination of hypothermia and pure, unadulterated shock. She got into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and stared blankly at the dashboard. The digital clock read 7:02 p.m. Only 20 minutes had passed since she arrived. In 20 minutes, her entire life had been dismantled. She didn't start the car immediately. She couldn't. She just sat there in the dark, the heater blowing cold air until the engine warmed up, staring at the lit windows of her stolen home. The tears stopped falling, replaced by a profound, hollow emptiness. They thought they had won. They thought they had used the law to trap her. Eleanor reached into her purse, her fingers brushing against her wallet, until she found her old ID badge from her 25 years as a senior paralegal at Vance and Associates Real Estate Law. She squeezed the plastic card, the sharp edges cutting into her thumb. They thought they knew the law, but they had only learned how to abuse it. They didn't know how it could fight back. The neon sign of the budget flickered through the rain, casting a sickly greenish glow across the cracked linoleum floor of room 114. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpets, and industrial-strength bleach, a suffocating cocktail that made Eleanor's stomach turn. She sat on the edge of the queen-sized bed, the springs groaning underneath her small frame. Her damp clothes clung to her skin, sending violent shivers through her body, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Her mind was trapped on a loop, replaying the cold, digital click of the smart lock and the chilling detachment in Julian's voice. Asterisk, we changed the locks, Mom. You're trespassing. Asterisk. A mother's memory is a vast archive of sacrifices. As Eleanor stared at the water stains on the motel ceiling, the archives forced themselves open. She remembered the winter Julian was 7, when he caught a severe bout of pneumonia. She had stayed awake for 4 consecutive days, sitting by his bedside in the crowded county hospital, pressing cold washcloths to his burning forehead, whispering that everything would be okay. She had skipped meals to afford his asthma medication, worked extra secretarial shifts to buy him his first laptop for college, and signed over her own vehicle to him when his car broke down. She had spent her entire life building a fortress of security around her son. And tonight he had used the bricks of that fortress to build a wall to shut her out. With trembling fingers, Eleanor unpacked her single suitcase. She placed David's silver pocket watch on the scratched nightstand. The rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the old timepiece was the only comforting sound in the room, a fragile tether to a life that no longer existed. She wrapped herself in the thin, coarse motel blanket and finally allowed the tears to come. Not out of anger, but out of a profound, suffocating grief. Her son was gone. The boy she raised had been hollowed out, replaced by a weak, compromised stranger controlled by a malicious whisperer. By 3 a.m., the tears dried up, replaced by a cold, sharp lucidity. Eleanor was tired, but her mind, trained by 25 years of navigating the labyrinth of New Jersey property law, began to click into gear. She knew exactly what Chloe and Margot were doing. They were exploiting squatters' rights and the state's aggressive tenant protection laws. In New Jersey, if someone resides in a property for over 30 days, establishes a mailing address, and has any form of written agreement, even a sham $1 lease signed by a co-occupant like Julian, they cannot be forcefully removed by the police. It was a civil matter. To evict them legally, Eleanor would have to file an unlawful detainer lawsuit, a grueling bureaucratic nightmare that could take anywhere from 6 to 12 months and cost thousands in legal fees. Chloe knew this. Margot, who had bounced from one scam rental to another her entire adult life, definitely knew this. They expected Eleanor to break. They expected her to scream, threaten, or call the police. Actions that would allow them to file a restraining order and bar her from the property permanently. They think I'm just an old woman with a broken heart, Eleanor whispered to the empty room, her voice steadying. They forgot what I did for a living. The next morning, the humiliation deepened. At 8:30 a.m., Eleanor's phone buzzed with a notification from a local Facebook community group, a digital neighborhood watch with over 20,000 members. It was a post by Chloe. The post featured a heavily filtered picture of Chloe and Julian looking exhausted, holding hands. The caption read, "Asterisk, it breaks my heart to have to share this, but our family is going through a devastating crisis. For months, Julian and I have tried to care for his mother, Eleanor, as her mental health declines. Unfortunately, her behavior has become increasingly volatile and unsafe. Yesterday, after a violent outburst where she threatened my elderly mother, we had to make the agonizing choice to change the locks for our own safety. We pray she gets the professional psychiatric help she desperately needs. Please respect our privacy during this painful time." Asterisk. The comments were already pouring in. Neighbors Eleanor had known for 2 decades. People she had shared barbecues with, people whose children she had baked cookies for, were leaving sympathetic messages for Chloe. "Oh honey, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this," one wrote. Asterisk, dementia makes elderly parents so aggressive. Stay strong. Asterisk, another commented. Asterisk, you are a saint for protecting your mother, Chloe. Eleanor needs to be in a facility. Asterisk. The smear campaign was surgical. Chloe wasn't just stealing Eleanor's house. She was preemptively destroying her reputation, ensuring that if Eleanor tried to tell the truth, the community would view her as a crazy, vindictive old woman. Eleanor's hand shook as she scrolled through the comments. A hot flash of indignation burned through her veins, melting the last remnants of her grief. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They were weaponizing her own community against her, using fake empathy as a dagger. Before she could process the betrayal of her neighbors, a sharp chime signaled an incoming email. It was from a law firm in downtown Newark, representing the occupants of 44 Elmwood Lane. Eleanor opened the attached PDF. It was a formal legal notice. Because Julian had established a valid sublease with Margot, and because Eleanor was the registered deed holder of the property, she was legally classified as the landlord. The letter stated that under New Jersey tenant anti-harassment statutes, any attempt by the landlord to shut off utilities, interrupt internet access, or stop routine lawn maintenance would be considered a constructive eviction, a severe civil offense. Furthermore, the letter demanded that Eleanor immediately repair a malfunctioning HVAC unit that Chloe claimed was causing Margot respiratory distress, threatening to sue Eleanor for treble damages if she failed to comply within 48 hours. They were forcing her to pay for the electricity they used to cook her food. They were forcing her to pay for the water they used to wash their clothes. They were trapping her in a financial chokehold, using her own property as the rope. Eleanor stood up from the creaking motel bed and walked over to the bathroom mirror. She looked at her reflection. Her eyes were bloodshot, and there were dark circles of exhaustion etched into her skin. She looked fragile. She looked defeated. But as she stared at her own eyes, a cold, familiar steel returned to her gaze. Chloe and Margot had played a perfect game of checkers. They had read the handbooks, found the loopholes, and executed their trap with vicious precision. They thought they had backed her into a corner where her only choices were a year-long, bankrupting court battle, or a humiliated surrender. What they didn't realize was that Eleanor didn't play checkers. She spent 25 years drafting the very contracts that landlords and developers used to protect themselves from predators exactly like Margot. She knew the law better than the attorney they had hired. She knew that while tenant laws in New Jersey heavily protected occupants from being evicted, the law also strictly defined the rights of a primary property owner who cohabitate with tenants. The house on Elmwood Lane was a registered 4-bedroom single-family home with a finished walkout basement and a massive master suite, spaces that were legally distinct under local housing ordinances. Chloe and Margot had claimed tenancy over the property, but their fraudulent lease agreement, signed by Julian, only specified occupancy of the upstairs residential quarters. They had left the rest of the house legally unassigned. Eleanor sat down at the small motel desk, pulled out her laptop, and opened a blank document. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, the clicking of the keys sounding like a drumbeat of war. She didn't call Julian. She didn't reply to Chloe's Facebook post. She didn't yell, and she didn't cry. Instead, she opened her professional contacts directory and scrolled down to a specialized boutique agency she had worked with during her paralegal days. Metropolitan Property Transition Management. They didn't handle standard real estate. They handled high-risk property reclamation. You want a legal battle? Eleanor whispered into the quiet room. A cold, dark smile finally touching her lips. I'm going to give you a masterclass. The Office of Metropolitan Property Transition Management was located in an industrial park just off Route 4, tucked away behind a commercial truck rental depot. There were no plush leather chairs or mahogany desks here. The walls were painted a utilitarian gray, adorned only with framed certificates of compliance, local zoning maps, and a large dry erase calendar tracking property schedules. Behind the desk sat Marcus Vance, no relation to Eleanor, though they had worked together on several ugly commercial foreclosure cases a decade ago. Marcus was a mountain of a man, a retired Jersey City police captain who had spent the second half of his career mastering the hyper-specific, frustratingly complex world of state housing regulations. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms thick as oak trunks. He slid a paper cup of black coffee across the desk to Eleanor. I read the paperwork you emailed over last night, Elle. It's ugly. Your son's signature on that sublease to the mother-in-law makes it a brick wall for local PD. If you call the cops to kick them out, they'll look at Margot's mail, look at that lease, and tell you it's a civil matter. You try to lock them out again, and Chloe's lawyer will have you in front of a housing judge before sundown, charging you with landlord harassment. Eleanor took a slow sip of the scalding coffee. The warmth spread through her chest, but it did nothing to thaw the icy determination that had settled into her bones over the last 24 hours. I know the statutes, Marcus. I drafted half the addendums the city uses for multifamily conversions back in the 90s. I'm not trying to evict them. Marcus raised a thick eyebrow. Then what are you doing here? Eleanor pulled a neatly organized blue folder from her purse and laid it flat on the desk. She tapped the top document with a manicured fingernail. This is the original deed to 44 Elmwood Lane. It's registered as a single-family dwelling, but under Section 40A of the Municipal Housing Code, the property possesses a uniquely divisible layout. The master suite occupies the entire eastern wing with its own exterior balcony access. The finished walkout basement has a separate kitchen, a full bathroom, and a private egress to the driveway. Julian's sham lease with Margot explicitly states she is renting the upstairs secondary bedrooms. It makes no mention of the master suite, the basement, or the common living room. Marcus's eyes crinkled at the corners. A slow, knowing grin began to spread across his weathered face. The partial occupancy loophole. Exactly, Eleanor said. her voice dropping to a calm, professional cadence. They established tenancy in part of my house, assuming it gave them dominion over the whole house. But as the sole deed holder, I retain the legal right to occupy or rent out any unleased, vacant square footage of that property. And since they have made it clear that my presence makes them feel unsafe. She practically spat the word, remembering Chloe's Facebook smear campaign. I am exercising my right to lease the remaining portions of my home to new tenants. Short term. Cash in hand. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the heavy springs groaning under his weight. He let out a low whistle. And let me guess. You aren't looking to rent to a nice, quiet young couple from the community college. I need people who understand how to occupy a space, Marcus. People who know their rights, who won't be intimidated by a slimy letter from a strip mall lawyer, and who are, let's say, structurally formidable. Marcus laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the cinderblock walls. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick binder filled with commercial tenant profiles. You came to the right place. I've got just the ticket. You remember Big Mike? Michael Kowalski. Eleanor nodded slowly. The union rep for the local concrete workers? The very same, Marcus said, flipping through the pages until he found a laminated sheet. Mike and 4 of his senior foremen are in the middle of a massive 6-month highway reconstruction project over on the turnpike. They've been commuting 2 hours each way from South Jersey. Because motel rates in Bergen County are astronomical right now, they've been looking for a shared house to rent. Something with a big driveway for their heavy-duty trucks and a kitchen where they can cook their own meals. They are disciplined, law-abiding union men. They don't drink on job nights, they don't do drugs, and they pay every single dime on the first of the month cash. He slid the profile over to Eleanor. A photo showed 5 men standing in front of a construction site. They were massive, heavily tattooed, bearded men wearing high-visibility vests and steel-toed boots. They looked like an old-school biker gang, but their records were spotless. They're giant teddy bears if you're good to them, Marcus chuckled. But to someone who doesn't know them? They look like the end of the world. And more importantly, Big Mike knows the law. His brother is a municipal judge in Newark. If your daughter-in-law tries to scream harassment, Mike will hand her a copy of his lease agreement and the local noise ordinances before she can finish dialing 911. Eleanor looked at the photo. She thought of Chloe's smug face through the smart doorbell camera. She thought of Margot, lounging in her living room, treating her late husband's home like a conquered territory. Let's draft the lease, Eleanor said softly. $300 a week per man. Full access to the master suite, the basement, the kitchen, and the living room. Effective immediately. At 44 Elmwood Lane, the afternoon had been peaceful. Margot was sitting on Eleanor's plush velvet sofa, her feet up on the mahogany coffee table, scrolling through the thousands of likes on Chloe's Facebook post. The air conditioning was humming beautifully, fixed promptly by the HVAC technician Eleanor had been legally forced to pay for that morning. In the kitchen, Chloe was humming a tune, pouring herself a glass of Eleanor's expensive white wine. Julian sat at the dining table, staring blankly at his laptop. There was a knot of anxiety in his stomach that hadn't gone away since they changed the locks. But every time he expressed doubt, Chloe would kiss his cheek and remind him that they were doing this for their future children. Your mother has plenty of money, Julian, she had whispered. Asterisk, she's just hoarding it. We're just taking what's rightfully yours. Asterisk. At precisely 4:30 p.m., the quiet suburbs of Elmwood Lane were shattered. The roar of 3 massive, modified Ford F-350 diesel dually trucks rumbled down the street, their engines vibrating the glass in the front windows of the Vance home. The trucks didn't just drive past. They pulled directly into Eleanor's pristine, asphalt driveway, parking bumper to bumper, completely blocking Chloe's compact SUV and Julian's sedan. Margot sat up on the couch frowning. Julian? Did you order something? Who is parking those monster trucks in the driveway? Before Julian could answer, the heavy front door thudded open. There was no knocking. No electronic chime. The door simply swung wide, and Eleanor Vance stepped into the foyer. She was wearing a tailored trench coat, her hair perfectly coiffed, her expression as calm as a frozen lake. Behind her stood Marcus Vance, holding a video camera, and behind Marcus stood 5 of the largest human beings Julian had ever seen in his life. Big Mike stepped into the hallway first, his 6'4", 260-pound frame entirely blocking out the daylight from the doorway. He was wearing grease-stained Carhartt pants, work boots that left dusty prints on the polished hardwood, and a sleeveless shirt that put his massive, scarred biceps on full display. He carried a heavy duffel bag in each hand. The 4 other men followed him, filling the narrow foyer until the space felt suffocatingly small. "What is the meaning of this?" Chloe shrieked, running out of the kitchen, her wine glass trembling in her hand. "Eleanor, I told you, you are trespassing." "Julian, call the police. Call them right now." Julian scrambled to his feet, his face pale, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. Mom, what are you doing? You can't be here. We have a lease." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply took a step forward, reached into her coat, and pulled out a notarized copy of the new rental agreement. "You are absolutely right, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with an icy, professional civility. "You do have a lease for the upstairs bedrooms. And as the sole owner of this property, I have just executed a secondary, fully legal residential lease for the remaining vacant areas of this house. Meet your new roommates." Big Mike stepped forward, offering a hand the size of a catcher's mitt to Julian. Julian stared at it, frozen in sheer terror. "Name's Mike," the giant said, his deep, gravelly voice rattling the crystal droplights in the foyer. "Me and the boys are going to be living in the master suite and the basement for the next 6 months. Don't worry, we're real quiet sleepers. But we wake up early, 4:30 a.m. sharp. We like our breakfast heavy, bacon, eggs, raw onions. We'll be using the kitchen quite a bit." Margot came storming out of the living room, her face purple with rage. "This is illegal. You can't just bring these thugs into our home. I am a legal tenant. I have rights." Marcus Vance stepped forward, raising the video camera to capture Margot's face. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus Vance, licensed property manager in the state of New Jersey. Everything happening right now is completely compliant with state housing statutes. These men have a signed, notarized lease and have paid their security deposit. Any attempt to bar them from entering the common areas, the kitchen, or their designated sleeping quarters will be considered an illegal lockout under New Jersey Statute 2A, 39-1. If you touch their property, or if you interfere with their quiet enjoyment of this domicile, I will personally file criminal mischief charges against you before the court opens tomorrow morning." Chloe looked from Marcus to the 5 massive construction workers, who were already dropping their heavy duffel bags on the pristine living room carpet. One of them, a man named Tiny who weighed at least 300 pounds, walked directly into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a carton of milk, drinking straight from the container. "Julian!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking into a panicked, high-pitched wail. "Do something. They're ruining the house. Throw them out." Julian looked at Big Mike, who was staring down at him with a calm, unblinking intensity. He looked at Eleanor, whose eyes were completely devoid of the maternal warmth he had taken for granted his entire life. He realized, with a sudden, sickening drop in his stomach, that his mother wasn't crying anymore. The game had changed, and Gary's tired voice crackled through the speaker, devoid of his previous arrogance. Chloe, listen to me carefully. Legally, it's not harassment. Your mother-in-law didn't cut off your water. She didn't change your locks. She moved in co-tenants. Unless those men physically threaten you, damage your personal property, or violate local noise ordinances after 11 p.m., they have every right to be there. If you call the police, they will look at their lease, look at your lease, and tell you to settle it in civil court. And Big Mike finally looked up. His eyes weren't angry. They were completely cold, filled with the hardened indifference of a man who had spent 30 years managing unruly union laborers on high-stress jobs. "According to the lease your mother signed with us, this is a shared common space. We need to review the turnpike specs before the 7 a.m. pour. If you want to eat breakfast, you can use the counter space by the toaster. Just don't touch the blueprints." Julian stood in the center of the kitchen, feeling like a ghost in his own childhood home. He looked out the window and saw his mother's Volvo still parked on the street. Eleanor was standing by the curb, holding a travel mug, talking calmly to the local mail carrier. She looked rested. She looked immaculate. She looked like the matriarch she had always been, entirely unbothered by the chaos unfolding inside her walls. A heavy wave of shame washed over Julian, so intense it made his knees weak. He remembered the smug satisfaction he had felt when he watched his mother walk down the cobblestone path in the rain 2 days ago. He had convinced himself that he was the victim, that she was selfish for keeping her wealth to herself. But looking at the industrial invasion of her beautiful house, looking at how she had turned his own legal manipulation into a weapon, he realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't beaten his mother. He had simply broken her patience. And a mother who has run out of patience is the most dangerous adversary alive. He turned around and walked back upstairs, his boots dragging. When he entered the master bedroom, Chloe was sitting on the floor, surrounded by 3 packed duffel bags. Her face was streaked with tears, her makeup ruined. Margot was lying on the bed, a wet washcloth over her forehead, wheezing softly. "I can't do this, Julian," Chloe sobbed, her voice breaking. "I can't live like this. The smell of grease is in my clothes. I can't use the bathroom because there's no hot water, and one of those men left a dirty work boot in the hallway. We have to leave. We have to find an apartment." "With what money, Chloe?" Julian asked, his voice dead and hollow. "We spent our savings on your mother's moving costs, and the retainer for that lawyer. We don't have first month's rent and a security deposit for a new place." "Then beg your mother," Chloe yelled, her anger flaring through her desperation. "Go down there, swallow your pride, and tell her we'll leave if she gives us enough money to get an apartment. She won't let her own son starve on the street." Julian looked at his wife, really looked at her, and for the first time, the veil of manipulation fell away. He saw the naked selfishness, the complete lack of remorse for what they had done to Eleanor. Even now, defeated and broken, Chloe was still looking for a way to milk his mother for cash. "She won't give us a dime, Chloe," Julian said softly, walking over to his own closet to grab his work clothes. "And honestly, we don't deserve it." The breaking point arrived at 6:15 p.m. on Thursday. The summer heat had settled over New Jersey like a heavy, humid wool blanket. Inside 44 Elmwood Lane, the central air conditioning was running at maximum capacity, but the air felt thick, saturated with the competing odors of industrial floor cleaner, diesel exhaust, and another massive batch of garlic-heavy sausage meat being fried in the kitchen. Chloe stood in the upstairs hallway, her hands clutched so tightly around her phone that her knuckles were entirely bloodless. She hadn't showered in 48 hours. Her hair was pulled back into a messy, grease-stained bun, and her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and redolent of pork fat. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the terrifying, structural rumble of the 3 Ford F-350s idling in the driveway. She couldn't take it anymore. The psychological confinement was absolute. She felt like a prisoner in a fortress she had spent months trying to steal. "Julian, go downstairs," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking with an edge of pure, unadulterated hysteria. "Go down there right now. Your mother is sitting on the porch. She's been there for an hour. Go make a deal with her. Tell her we'll sign the house back over to her control. Tell her my mother will leave tonight, but she needs to cut us a check for $10,000 so we can get a security deposit on a townhouse in Fort Lee. We need a way out." Julian, sitting on the top step of the stairs in his wrinkled work slacks, didn't move. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His phone was buzzing in his pocket, a text from his boss warning him about his slipping performance at the firm today, but he ignored it. "She won't negotiate, Chloe," Julian said, his voice entirely flat, devoid of any resonance. "You don't understand her. You thought she was just a quiet old lady who collected pension checks. When my dad died, she spent 3 weeks handling the probate court by herself without shedding a single tear in public. She doesn't break." "I don't care about your psychological analysis of your mother, Julian," Chloe hissed, stepping closer and grabbing his shoulder, her fingernails digging through his shirt. "My mother is wheezing in that bedroom. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. Go down there, and use the fact that you are her only son. She carried you for 9 months, Julian. Use it." Julian looked up at his wife. The desperate, predatory hunger in her eyes disgusted him. He slowly reached up, took her hand off his shoulder, and pushed it away. He stood up, his joints popping from hours of tense sitting, and walked down the stairs. Every step down was an admission of defeat. As he crossed the living room, he had to navigate a literal obstacle course of working-class dominion. 2 massive coolers filled with ice and Gatorade sat next to the television stand. Hank was sitting in the armchair, wearing a clean shirt but still smelling of dry cement, quietly reading a paperback thriller. He didn't even look up as Julian passed. The dining table was still covered in rolled-up blueprints, anchored by a heavy wrench. Julian pushed open the heavy oak front door and stepped onto the porch. The evening air was thick and warm. Eleanor Vance was sitting in one of the wicker rocking chairs David had bought her for their silver anniversary. She was holding a glass of iced tea, her fingers lightly tracing the condensation on the glass. She wore a simple, elegant linen dress. She looked perfectly cool, perfectly calm, and entirely detached from the war zone 20 feet behind her. Julian stopped 3 feet away from her. The silence between them stretched out, heavy and suffocating, filled only with the distant hum of the highway and the rhythmic creak-creak-creak of Eleanor's rocking chair. "Mom," Julian started, his voice cracking on the single syllable. Eleanor didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching a robin hop across the manicured lawn of the neighbors who had called her a monster on Facebook just 2 days ago. "Yes, Julian? We can't do this anymore," Julian said, his knees trembling. He sank down onto the top step of the porch, burying his face in his hands, just like he used to do when he was a little boy who had scraped his knee on the playground. "Chloe is losing her mind. Margot can barely breathe with the smoke from the kitchen. We made a mistake. I made a mistake." Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. The ice clinked musically against the glass. "A mistake, Julian? A mistake is forgetting to buy milk on the way home. A mistake is leaving the garage door open. What you did was a calculated, legal ambush against the woman who gave you life." Chloe said. "Chloe said you had enough," Julian whispered, his tears finally breaking through his exhaustion, hot and shameful against his palms. "She said you were hoarding the life insurance money. She said we were drowning in debt and you didn't care." Eleanor finally turned her head. Her eyes weren't filled with anger. They were filled with something far more terrifying. Absolute, clinical clarity. "I paid for your Ivy League education, Julian. I paid off your credit card debt twice before you turned 26. I opened my doors to you and your wife when you couldn't afford your rent," Eleanor said, her voice a low, steady vibration that cut through the summer humidity. "I didn't hoard my money. I hoarded my boundaries. I wanted you to become a man, Julian. But instead, you let a cruel, small-minded woman turn you into a thief." "I'm sorry, Mom," Julian sobbed, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry. Please. Just give us enough to get out. $10,000. Just for a deposit on an apartment. We'll leave tonight. We'll give you the house back. Just please don't hate me." Eleanor looked at her son. The boy she had stayed up with through pneumonia. The boy she had protected from every harsh winter of life. A deep, heavy pang of maternal grief mirrored in her chest. A phantom ache of the love she had poured into an empty vessel. But she didn't soften. She couldn't. If she broke now, she would validate his weakness forever. "I don't hate you, Julian," Eleanor said softly, turning her gaze back to the street. "But I am not giving you a single dime. You chose the law as your weapon when you changed my locks and left my suitcase in the rain. You chose to use legal tenancy to rob me of my dignity. So we will stay within the boundaries of the law." "Mom, please. You want to leave, Julian? Then pack your bags and leave." Eleanor cut him off, her tone shifting into the ice-cold finality of a senior legal partner closing a file. "But you will do it on your own dime. You will find a way to pay for your own life, just like your father and I did. There is no check coming. There is no negotiation. You have until tomorrow morning to decide if you want to keep living with 5 concrete foremen, or if you want to remember how to be a man." She stood up, her glass of tea in her hand, and walked back toward the front door. She didn't look back at him. As she pulled the heavy oak door open, the sound of the workers' laughter drifted out onto the porch, loud, heavy, and completely unbothered. Julian sat on the porch step in the dark, the summer rain starting to fall again in tiny, warm drops. realizing that the mother he thought he could manipulate had died the moment he changed the locks. In her place stood a woman who would rather watch his world burn than let him win with a lie. By Friday night, the war of attrition was over. The psychological weight of the past 48 hours had done what no screaming match or legal threat could ever accomplish. It had utterly dismantled the alliance between Chloe, Julian, and Margot. The house smelled faintly of lemon-scented pine sol, mixed with the residual, heavy grease of the workers' dinners. At 7:30 p.m., the front door of 44, Elmwood Lane opened. Margot was the first to exit. She looked haggard, her posture defeated, carrying 2 oversized canvas bags. She didn't look back at the house, nor did she say goodbye to her daughter. She hailed an Uber, shoved her belongings into the trunk, and vanished into the evening traffic, retreating to a distant relative's couch in Pennsylvania. An hour later, Chloe followed. She walked down the cobblestone path holding a single roller bag, her face a mask of bitter, silent rage. Her phone was wedged between her shoulder and her ear, as she loudly argued with a friend about letting her crash on their sofa for a few days. She didn't look at Julian, who stood by the garage, watching her leave with the hollow, unblinking stare of a man who had survived a shipwreck. Their marriage wasn't just fractured. It was extinct, buried under the weight of their mutual greed. When the taillights of Chloe's car disappeared around the corner, Julian finally turned and walked into the house. The lower level was surprisingly quiet. The evening shift workers were down in the basement watching a baseball game, their muted cheers filtering through the floorboards. Big Mike was sitting at the dining room table, methodically folding his blueprints and packing them into a heavy leather tube. Julian walked up to the table, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "They're gone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Big Mike didn't look up immediately. He finished capping the tube, snapped the brass latches shut, and then turned his massive frame toward Julian. His weathered face held no malice, only the heavy, grounded wisdom of a man who spent his life dealing with structural realities. "I know," Mike said, his deep voice carrying a strange, unexpected softness. "Your mother called me an hour ago. She told us our short-term lease is fulfilled. The boys and I are packing up our gear. We'll be out of the master suite by midnight." Julian blinked, a knot of confusion tightening in his chest. She called off the lease? But you guys had 6 months. Mike let out a low, rumbling chuckle, standing up to his full height, and throwing a heavy duffel bag over his shoulder. "Kid, we never had a 6-month lease. Your mother hired our firm for a week-long property transition. She paid our union a premium to relocate our housing for 5 days. She knew exactly how long it would take for that mother-in-law of yours to crack under the pressure of 5 concrete guys frying onions at midnight." Julian stared at him, the sheer genius and cold execution of his mother's counterattack finally sinking in. She hadn't surrendered her home to an industrial invasion. She had choreographed a targeted, legal exorcism. "Your mother is a hell of a woman, Julian," Mike said, pausing at the threshold of the front door. He looked back at the younger man, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She didn't do this to destroy you. If she wanted to destroy you, she would have let you keep this house until the debt and the lawsuits dragged you under. She did this to save you from yourself. Don't waste the lesson." With a heavy thud, the front door closed behind Big Mike. The last of the Ford F-350s rumbled out of the driveway, the deep vibration of their engines fading into the quiet suburban night. The silence that returned to 44, Elmwood Lane was absolute, but it wasn't the warm, peaceful silence Julian remembered from his childhood. It was a sterile, echoing emptiness. He walked through the living room, looking at the pristine furniture, the polished wood, the family photos still hanging on the walls. It was a beautiful house, a monument to 30 years of hard work, but it no longer felt like a home. It felt like a courtroom where judgment had just been passed. He sat down on the bottom step of the staircase, the very spot where he had sat as a child waiting for his father to come home from work. He buried his face in his hands, the quiet weight of the empty house pressing down on his chest, waiting for the one person he had betrayed to come back and claim what was hers. The front door clicked open at precisely 9 a.m. on Saturday. The morning sun streamed into the foyer, cutting through the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Eleanor Vance stepped into her home, carrying nothing but her purse and a small bouquet of fresh lavender she had bought at the local farmer's market. She walked into the living room. The house was immaculate. The concrete workers had left it spotless. Their heavy-duty presence vanished as if they were nothing more than a fever dream. The air was clean, carrying only the faint, crisp scent of lemon polish and summer breeze. Julian was sitting at the kitchen island. He hadn't slept. He was still wearing the same wrinkled shirt from the night before, his hands cradling a mug of cold coffee. When he heard her footsteps, he didn't jump up. He slowly raised his head, his eyes hollow, filled with a raw, agonizing humility that Eleanor hadn't seen in him since he was a teenager confessing to a broken window. "Mom," he whispered. His voice was cracked, stripped of all the defensive armor he had worn earlier in the week. Eleanor placed the lavender in a glass vase on the counter. She looked at her son, and for the first time in days, the ice in her demeanor thawed, revealing the deep, aching exhaustion of a mother who had just fought a war for her child's soul. She didn't offer a dramatic speech. She didn't gloat. She simply sat down on the stool across from him. "The house is quiet again," Eleanor said softly, her eyes resting on the pantry door frame where David had carved Julian's height marks years ago. "I'm sorry, Mom." Julian broke down, the words tearing from his throat in a ragged sob. He didn't ask for money this time. He didn't mention Chloe or Margot. He just reached across the marble counter, his hand trembling, leaving it open, desperate for a connection he had so carelessly severed. "I ruined everything. I let them convince me that you were the enemy. I was so greedy, so blind. I don't even know who I am anymore." Eleanor looked at his open hand. She didn't grasp it immediately. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the counter toward him. Julian wiped his eyes and opened it. Inside was a list of small, one-bedroom apartments for rent in an affordable neighborhood near his office, along with a contact number for a local moving company. There was no check inside. No financial lifeline. "You lost your way, Julian," Eleanor said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of an unshakable love that refused to indulge weakness. "You let a parasitic relationship erode your integrity until you thought it was acceptable to leave your mother in the rain. I could have paid off your debts. I could have bought you a house. But if I did, I would be financing the destruction of my own son." Julian stared at the apartment listings, a fresh wave of tears blurring his vision. "You're kicking me out." "No," Eleanor replied gently, but with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "I am releasing you. You are 30 years old, Julian. It is time for you to build your own life from the bedrock up, without using my sacrifices as your foundation. You will move into one of these apartments. You will pay your own rent. You will look at your bills every month and realize the true value of $1, and more importantly, the value of an honest name." Julian swallowed hard, the harsh reality of his new life setting in. He had no savings, a broken marriage, and a mountain of credit card debt. He was starting over from absolute zero. But as he looked at his mother's calm, resolute face, the suffocating panic in his chest began to transform into something else. A strange, terrifying sense of relief. The lies were gone. The manipulation was gone. There was only the truth left. Can I still come over for Sunday dinner?" Julian asked, his voice small, vulnerable. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, warm smile that finally reached her eyes, bringing the matriarch back to the home she had successfully defended. She reached across the counter and gently placed her hand over his. "Sunday dinners are for family, Julian," Eleanor said softly. "And you will always be my son. But next Sunday, you bring the dessert. And you pay for it yourself." Julian let out a weak, watery laugh, squeezing his mother's hand with a profound sense of gratitude. He had lost the house, he had lost his pride, and he had lost the life he thought he wanted. But as he looked around the sunlit kitchen, he realized he had gained something far more valuable. He had found his boundaries. He had found his mother. And on the long, hard road ahead, he would finally learn how to find himself.